Hey everyone, it's John. I'm here with Marc Victor from Attorneys for Freedom, and I have another video that we're going to walk through that Marc and I have just watched. And once we do that, I think we have some interesting discussions here about when I can reasonably feel that my life is in danger, and if I do, what means can I use to protect myself? So let's talk about it. Today's video is brought to us by the generosity of Firearms Legal Protection. Firearms Legal Protection is a legal defense program for lawful gun owners. You win the fight, and they will help you win the fight after the fight for the rest of your life. There's a link in the description for a coupon code for a discount for all active self-protection watchers. So I want you to watch the video. We'll put a card up in here and all that. And it's one that, Marc, you looked at and were like, man, this one seems pretty cut and dried to me.
Well, normally there would be a lot to talk about, but you pretty much stole all my thunder. I agree with what you said in the original video. You made some of the points twice. I think a lot of the practical advice that you gave, I think, is really spot on. A couple of things I would add. First of all, this issue of, can you use deadly physical force and when? I mean, to me, this looks like a situation that's pretty clear. You get to use deadly physical force because what you have here is certainly an imminent threat, right? It's clear that these guys are hostile. They sort of signaled that before they even stopped and got out of the car.
Coming by and, waving fists.
I mean, it's almost like a law school exam, right? When you have a guy coming at you with a baseball bat and his intentions are fairly hostile, if you're not sure about that, he just smashed your window, right? So I think you're looking at an imminent threat. Because he's got a baseball bat, I think it's very reasonable to assume that this is a threat of either death or serious physical injury. So I think you're in pretty good shape here. The question is, in my mind, a couple of things. Can you just run the guy over? What if you have an option to just drive out of there? And so the issue that pops into my head is somebody who may have just pulled out a gun and say shot through the glass, as you maybe mentioned initially. I could see a prosecutor saying to me, look, Marc, your guy could have used a lot less force than he used here. And as we know, you only get to use as much force as is reasonably necessary to repel the attack. You don't get carte blanche to do whatever you want. So I tell a story sometimes when I talk about this issue that I can say very quickly. I had a guy who basically got into a fight with his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend. There was a lot of hostility going back and forth.
Problems coming from exes, friends. People are crazy.
And my guy comes in and says, hey, the ex-boyfriend showed up at my house, knocked at the door and said, I'm going to kick your butt, and we got into a fight. Why am I charged? Well, the answer is because he really beat the guy up bad. He left the guy a bloody mess in his front lawn. And I remember the prosecutor saying to me, exactly correct, look, Marc, your guy had a right to defend himself, but he went too far. When he showed me the pictures, I had to concede. A jury would think he went too far. So if the guy in the car just simply runs down the bad guy with the bat, what he could have just simply driven away, somebody's probably going to say, hey, you used too much force. Now, on the other hand, I think that if that argument was thrown at me, certainly in this state, I would say back to him, wait a second, my guy has no such duty to retreat.
Okay.
Driving away, although he might have been able to do that's only for a state where he had a duty to retreat. And I'm in a state that I don't have a duty to retreat. My guy doesn't have to go anywhere, and he still can defend himself. These are the kinds of arguments that lawyers make when the situation is done, right? And so what I would say is don't put yourself in that type of a situation. I always say, even in a state like Arizona, where you don't have to retreat. You can stand your ground, as they like to say in Florida, or as we say in Arizona, we have no legal duty to retreat before employing your right to self-defense. That doesn't mean it's smart to do that. And it's a very important point. Right?
I've definitely heard before, to be a smart self-defender, you should ignore stand your ground laws.
I once, in an airline catastrophe case where a plane went down, I was talking to an expert pilot who said something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing now, expert pilots use their expert judgments to avoid situations in which their expert piloting skills would be required. I always thought that was an excellent point. I feel the same way about excellent people who are prepared for self-defense. This one's an easy one, right?
Sure.
You see these guys, you see you got a problem, you're in your car. I don't even know why this guy stopped in the first place. Keep driving, turn around, lock your doors at least, right? But just drive out of this. Is an easy one to get away. The guy's got a bat. It doesn't appear he's got a gun, although it's not clear from the video if the other guy didn't. To me, that's close enough that if I had a gun and a guy stood in front and made that motion like he had a gun, I'm going to shoot the guy right there. I'm not going to take the chance that he's trying to fake me out. But short of that, I'm never going to stop my car in a situation like that. And that was a big mistake this guy made.
Well, and he's in a rural area. I get it. Maybe he's like, what am I going to do? There's help's 20 miles away, you know, these kind of things. But I think, you know, from what I've been taught, the word that we talk about with this problem is preclusion. You could have done something else that would have been easier. If you just, you know, these guys pile out of the car and you just go out guns a-blazing, then some prosecutor might think, hey, man, you didn't have to use your gun. So there's a difference between can and must.
Yeah, you know, I always tell people that in trying to figure out in a split second if this is the time to pull out the firearm and maybe even discharge a round, I think you got to be willing to be prosecuted. I'm not saying you're always going to be prosecuted.
Right.
In fact, if there's a lot of prosecutors that do an excellent job at figuring out what ought to be prosecuted and what should not be prosecuted. But if you're not prepared to be prosecuted, then to me, the situation isn't serious enough. And I don't think at this point I would have wanted to be prosecuted if I could have just driven off.
Right.
So I'm not pulling my gun in this thing unless I get the guy aiming at me and I think he's got a gun. Then prosecute me all day long. I don't want, as they say, I'd rather be carried by 8 than judged by 12, right?
Well,
or actually, judged by 12 than carried by 8, yeah.
Well, and okay, so moments kind of matter here, because when these guys just pull up and stop, man, use your car and get the heck out of there. When the guy bashes in the windshield, I may be stuck in a spot where I go, listen, there's no other options here. I gotta use my firearm or, you know, whatever else I have. So moments like this, you know, when you used the force you used really matter.
Yeah, I'm going to guess here, we can't see the driver, right? But I'm going to guess here, probably what happened is this driver froze, right? He stopped, he didn't know what to do, the guys are coming. This is why, you know, as you've said on other occasions, you really need to think through some of these scenarios. What if this kind of thing happens, what would I do? What if that kind of thing happens, what would I do? As best you can. You can't think through every situation, but you want to get a general idea. I can tell you, if I'm in my car, I'm not going to stop. I'm not even going to speed like a madman. I'm pretty safe in my car, right? If we're driving down the road, someone could give me the finger all day long. They can be upset. I'm just going to turn on some smooth jazz or something, and I'm going to relax because I'm in my car and I'm safe and I'm not worried about that. Worst case scenario, I'm going to take my car and I'm going to drive at the legal speed right to the police station. And I'm going to get out there and say, hey guys, there's a crazy guy behind me. And I'm going to probably call him in advance and say, hey, here's where I am. I'm coming your way. There's a guy behind me. Here's what kind of car it is. That seems like the obvious thing to do in this situation.
It certainly does. Now, I did want to ask one other question here from a legal perspective. Okay, so it gets to a place where clearly we have an imminent threat of great bodily harm. And in that instance, you know, if you're under threat of great bodily harm or death, then you can use the necessary force to stop that. Is there any legal difference between if you had a tool like a firearm and you used it versus, say, using the car? If you had to run a guy over, is that seen legally any different than if you used, you know, a firearm or something like that?
Well, the issue here is, are you using force that's reasonably calculated to cause death or serious physical injury, right? I mean, in theory, you could use a gun in a way that is not deadly physical force, right? I mean, I could take my gun and I could take out the rounds and I could just use it to hit you with the thing or whatever. I'm not using deadly physical force, maybe if I'm hitting you in the head or something, and I'm not saying that's the best way to use the gun, right? But if you're out of rounds, what you got is a big paperweight. You got a rock. And you can use that for self-defense, and that's not necessarily deadly physical force. There are also some other arguments out there. Somebody who has a lot of training, I know you got a lot of hours at the range, you might say, look, I'm going to use my gun, but I'm not going to use it in a way that's deadly physical force. I'm going to shoot the guy in the kneecap because I want to stop him or something like that. Now, a lot of the self-defense guys will say, this isn't a smart thing to do for tactical reasons, and I completely understand that. But I'm a lawyer and I'm giving you legal arguments, and there might be a legal argument that my guy who's an expert with his firearm specifically intended not to use deadly physical force because he shot him in the kneecap. That's the kind of argument a skillful criminal defense lawyer will use. But again, you know, as I've said, don't put me in that position.
Don't do that.
You know, this is why we say keep your big mouth shut and those types of things, because You really don't want to hire a criminal defense lawyer unless you absolutely have to. And 9 times out of 10, you really could have avoided the situation.
But now, okay, so to finish that question though, if it was a firearm versus a car, any difference there? So you said, wait a minute, if I use the car,
Well, the same thing with the car, right? A car could be used as a deadly weapon and oftentimes is charged as a dangerous instrument, which is in Arizona equivalent to a deadly weapon in terms of the punishment that you get with the crime committed. So if you use the car to run somebody down, you're absolutely using deadly physical force, no question. I could use probably a pen in a way that could be deadly physical force as well. I don't need to necessarily say at what types of things could be deadly, but people who are skilled in these areas know how to use sharp instruments to cause death of other people. And so really, many things could be deadly physical force.
And if it's justified to use deadly physical force because you're in imminent threat of great bodily harm or death, well then it's okay, right?
Yeah,
then
and another way to say it is, would the people in that community find, objectively speaking, that what you did was reasonable under all of the circumstances committed? I mean, that's really the issue here. And we have these rules because we try to figure out in advance, yes, this is reasonable. Like, for example, if you use ordinary self-defense in response to mere words, you didn't like what somebody said and so you punch them in the face, we've decided in advance that's always unreasonable.
Right.
We can tell you right now that's unreasonable. If you use force and self-defense against a threat that's not imminent, well, we've already told you in advance the threat needs to be imminent if you want to use self-defense. So we've decided as a community that this is already unreasonable, which is why it's very important to actually read the law so you can get a feel of what the community has decided is reasonable or unreasonable. But at the end of the day, this is just a question for your fellow human beings in the community. Given everything we know, was it reasonable or unreasonable? And I can tell you, if I'm on this jury and this guy runs the guy with the baseball bat over and kills him, I'm not going to spend very long deliberating about this. I'm going to say, this guy's just fine. He gets off. He gets a free pass on this. And judged by the conduct of the guy with the baseball bat, probably did us all a favor.
Right, right. So I just wanted to make sure that we get that, though, that in that moment, these little moments matter, and understanding those principles as they come are great. But I really, at the end here, I want to reiterate what you said earlier from an expert pilot, right? That an expert pilot uses their expert judgment to keep them out of situations where they need their expert piloting skills. Likewise, an expert self-defender uses their expert judgment to keep themselves out of situation where they have to use their expert skills.
I think the big takeaway here is if you can avoid using force at all, that's always the smarter course of action. If you have to use force, use the minimal amount necessary. And even whether you're in a state that has a castle doctrine or not, if you got to retreat or not, regardless of that, if you can get out of there to live another day, that's the smarter play every time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me.